If you talk to Ukrainians in the military, the higher reaches of the military, they'll tell you that the Russian production of drones, attack drones, and long-range missiles has really gone up significantly in the last 18 months. And China is an important factor in that. So what all this tells you about the BRICS summit is that it's a chance for Putin to play court with some of the most powerful leaders in the world.
Now, Mark Urban is here, as he is every Monday, to talk us through the big foreign policy, diplomatic and defence stories. Welcome back, Mark.
Hi, Lara. Nice to see you in there.
Thank you. Can we talk now about the BRICS summit, if we may? That's the meeting of the leaders of Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. They're meeting tellingly in Russia, and they'll be joined by some new members. This group is always meant to be a counterbalance to Western power. Do you think it's seen as a success?
Well, I mean, let's look at this. When Russia was about to do the invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, Joseph Biden warned of what he called thermonuclear sanctions. He said no one will have ever seen anything like the kind of economic isolation that is going to follow if Russia goes into Ukraine. Well, they went in. There was a difficult period. And now, certainly during the past year and a half, what we've seen is Putin sort of regaining his position in many ways. And one of the things I think is most extraordinary about this meeting, which is in Kazan in southern Russia, is that Xi Jinping of China is going, and he very rarely goes to international events and summits. Narendra Modi of India is going. Cyril Ramaphosa of South Africa is going. The president of Brazil was meant to, but then he's now cited a medical reason for not going. So what you've got there with India and China is some really significant economic powerhouses. And, we know that India is very important, although it's considered in many ways a friend of the West, in helping Russia to export its energy, its petrol and other products. And in that sense has replaced a lot of the Western market for Russian energy. And China, of course, is very important in all sorts of ways, including, the latest reports would suggest in providing drones, microchips, sensors, all kinds of technologies that Russia needs to keep its war going, which is another thing that, Biden had threatened that if countries did that, they would be very powerful, what they call secondary sanctions. In other words, in order to reinforce the effect of the first line of sanctions against Russia, the country helping them to break those, in this case, China, would be subject to very severe secondary sanctions. Now, there have been some US sanctions against Chinese companies that have been pinpointed as sending technology to Russia. But there's no doubt about it. If you talk to Ukrainians in the military, the higher reaches of the military, they'll tell you that the Russian production of drones, attack drones, and long-range missiles has really gone up significantly in the last 18 months. And China is an important factor in that. So what all this tells you about the BRICS summit is that it's a chance for Putin to play court with some of the most powerful leaders in the world. And they are the leaders of the emergent economies, critically Russia, China and India. And it just shows how comprehensively Russia has been able, in a sense, to rewire its economic connections to the wider world and evade the sanctions that the US hoped it would suffer under.
Do you think that, leaders in the US and also our leaders here in the UK will be concerned about this summit? There's a suggestion that you don't have to it's not like you have to do that much to be part of this summit, right? It's a very good opportunity, even if you're not sympathetic to Putin, to go along to talk to other world leaders, as you say. But certainly the discussion of how to circumvent and evade the sanctions regime will definitely be, high on the agenda for some of those present, as you've mentioned. I mean, is there any way of defining this alliance as anything other than anti-Western?
Well, look, India and Brazil, I mentioned as well, are obviously, in a sense, pro-Western powers. Now, India, I think you could argue, has taken a sort of neutral stance. Some have even suggested that they could play a peacemaking role in the Ukraine war because they're regarded as sort of equidistant between Russia and the West. But India and Brazil are two very powerful emerging economies, and of course they're democracies. Now that's not the case with China and Russia. So in that sense, I think you can say, if you like, there's a Venn diagram here of overlapping states, and that while those ones are in the BRICS camp and they're happy to discuss closer economic ties with Russia, and indeed they're even happy in certain ways in India's case through the energy exports to help Russia circumvent sanctions, they are not actually pro-Russian or anti-Western. And then you've got the others in another circle of the Venn diagram, as it were, who are part of what they now call the axis of autocracies. So, a lot of Western security officials now use this phrase, and that would be Russia, China, and then Iran and North Korea. Now, they are, if you like, proving to be military allies. China, Iran, and North Korea are all providing weaponry, and now we know in the case of North Korea also soldiers. Reports that they're sending 15,000 soldiers to fight in Ukraine. So they are actively helping the Russians in a way that, in the view of Western countries, makes them adversaries. Whereas countries like India or Brazil, or South Africa indeed, who will also be at this summit, not so. But I think in the end, when you talk to people in the foreign ministries of Western countries, there is a sort of worry and a sense of regret that they haven't been able to convince those countries, that the neutrals, if you like, more of the value of standing shoulder to shoulder on a matter of international aggression like Ukraine, and that they're kind of losing them, as it were, that they are drifting into a new non-aligned bloc. Some people talk about the global south, but that they are increasingly resistant to the idea that what the US wants or what Western European countries want should determine their own policies. They're into national self-interest.
We're expecting Secretary of State Antony Blinken to go to Israel this week. He said he's more hopeful about a ceasefire in Gaza following the deaths of Hamas leader Yahya Sinwar. Do you think there's possible hope for movements on hostages now?
Well, it is clear that there were times during recent months when this kind of troika, the diplomatic group, which was the Americans, the Egyptians, and the Qataris, were trying to negotiate this, that Yahya Sinwar was the person standing in the way. And that's why the Americans think now is the time for a diplomatic push. And as you said, their chief diplomat, the Secretary of State, Tony Blinken, is going to Israel, I think tomorrow, but certainly this week. So that's why they're trying to do it. Now, of course, what we also know is that there have been other times when it's been Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu who's been the one who was not keen to make a deal. And that, in general, it's a sort of principle across the region, from Israel to Hamas to Hezbollah. No one wants to seem to be too keen to make a deal. That sounds strange, perhaps perverse, given the terrible loss of life going on. But I was talking to someone over the weekend about Hezbollah, and they said they just don't want to seem too ready to make a deal because otherwise it'll seem like they've been defeated. So, strange as it may sound, all of those are factors. And now going back to the question of the Gaza hostages, Prime Minister Netanyahu has this attitude now, well, I told you so. I ignored the Biden administration when they said, for example, don't go into Rafah, that town on the Egyptian border in the southern part of the Gaza Strip. And of course, he did ignore them, and that's where they found Yahya Sinwar, the leader of Hamas, and killed him. It's also possible, I think, that we can't really predict the effects of this on Hamas itself. Is there somebody empowered to make a deal with the Israelis now that the sort of absolutely prime leader is dead? Will there be a period, while factions are trying to work out who should represent the organization in this negotiation and whether or not they should move quickly to release the hostages?
I think this was one of the interesting questions that you asked in your piece in yesterday's Sunday Times about what the killing actually does for the hostages' cause, whether or not it leaves a power vacuum, for example, or causes a collapse in morale. Do you think we're any closer to actually being able to see what the consequences in the kind of upper echelons of the leadership of Hamas, what those consequences could be?
I think it's still going to take a little bit of time. And while there are clearly many in Israel who are yearning to use the opportunity to get the hostages back, it's obviously a prime national objective in everything that's happened. They don't want, as I said, to seem desperately keen to make this deal. I mean, it's a paradox, because what Netanyahu also knows is that while he likes to project the image that he's prepared to carry on, bombing and attacking Hamas and Hezbollah till the bitter end, until the hostages are out and he succeeds in all his other war aims, he does know that there's a pretty significant cost to the Israeli economy of going on. And also that the Israeli army is not that big in its standing form. So it has to call up tens of thousands of reservists to do these operations. And they're the sort of people who actually caught up with Sinwar last week and have been doing quite a bit of the fighting in Lebanon. So he can't afford to just keep doing that indefinitely. So at some point, he does have to make a deal. The question is now, is there someone on the end of the line with Hamas? We know, for example, that in recent days, the head of the Israeli Internal Security Service, it's like their equivalent of MI5, has been in Cairo talking to the head of the Egyptian military intelligence service. Now, that is just possibly a sign that they are now trying to work out who to talk to on the Hamas side with Egyptian assistance. So that is the merest slither, I think, of a positive sign that something may be moving.
And I mean, on the question of Israel's economy that you just mentioned, I think I read that, even though there will be a big economic cost to this, you're still looking at GDP coming down from something like 3.5 to 4% in growth to closer to kind of like 0.5%, obviously saying there is a big cost, but actually it is one that is weatherable, so to speak. It's not a kind of, mission critical cost, so to say. And I guess that kind of leads me to the question of Netanyahu's polling ratings, which look like they've gone up. And there's a suggestion, particularly in your column, that they could go up yet further after this killing of the Hamas leader.
Well, I think undoubtedly, many people in this country might not like what he's doing, but he is gaining in popularity. I mean, the whole reason that Israel got into this mess was his failure and the failure of the government and the military more generally to predict and foresee the 7th of October attack. And when I say the whole reason, I mean, from an Israeli perspective, clearly it was Hamas who launched that attack and in that sense are responsible. But there was an epic failure at the governmental level in Israel, which meant for months people blamed him for that, and he was very unpopular in the polling. But in the last few months, he's been coming up the sort of devastating early attacks, from the pagers to the strike that killed Hassan Nasrallah against Hezbollah, which is an enemy that many Israelis had feared for years, has had quite an effect. And now this killing of Sinwar, who once again, Israelis hold him responsible for the 7th of October. He was the principal architect, there's no doubt about that, will also be a boon to his popularity. So we may be getting close to the time where we have to sort of re-examine that narrative, which many on the Israeli left have, as well as people outside who are critical of Netanyahu, that he's keeping this war going for reasons of his own political survival, i.e., he may be politically strong enough to say, I don't want to still be in coalition with these two far-right parties that have been limiting my freedom of action in all sorts of ways, or indeed, I'm going to hold a general election. But I think to get to that point, he can't do that until he's done two other things. The first is achieved some sort of answer on the hostage track, i.e. to have got some or all of them out. The second is this question about retaliating against Iran. Does it risk at this delicate moment where there possibly could be a pivot towards a peaceful resolution in Gaza and Lebanon? Does that risk re-inflaming all the tensions if Israel strikes hard and then Iran, we've seen Iran attacking Israel earlier this month and in April. if Iran then comes back really hard and we're into a sort of general regional confrontation. So those are the difficult two things. But if those can be navigated, then I think Netanyahu could go to the country, or he could remake his coalition from a very strong political position, allowing him to end the war in that sense.